What's up, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls around the world? I would like to welcome you back to the Real Talk with Zuby podcast. On today's episode, we are going to be speaking to a journalist, a writer at the Christian Post, and this is Brandon Showalter. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. So good to be with you.
It's a pleasure. So I've done a very brief intro there, Brandon, but please introduce yourself for those who do not know.
My name is Brandon Showalter. I am an investigative journalist and podcaster at the Christian Post and have been so since the summer of 2016. I've covered a number of things, but have focused extensively on the developments of the global developments with regard to gender ideology. It's been a big focus of mine, but I do report on other things too. But that's been a tremendous focus of mine of late, especially in this last year.
I hear that, man. Before we get into your work, tell me a little bit about yourself and your background. How did you even get into the world of journalism? Where are you from? All that good stuff.
Born and raised in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, and I swore I'd never live and work in the Washington, D.C. area, but I guess God has a sense of humor. And I just had an opportunity. I was looking to do something different back in 2015, 2016, was working 3 jobs to make ends meet. In fact, I was a janitor in a church in early 2015, and I was thinking about what I was going to do next. And while I was mopping floors and scrubbing toilets, I just had this idea that I was going to write an essay about what it was like being a church janitor. So I submitted it to this blog site that I knew, and that turned into me having my own blog for a very short time, but then those blogs served as the writing samples for a career in reporting when that opportunity came my way, and the rest, as they say, is history.
That's so interesting. So
Shenandoah Valley, countryside, salt of the earth people. I'm from. Went to college there. Recently finished a master's degree at the Catholic University of America here in D.C., but I've returned to reporting after that.
That's awesome, man. And how did you get involved with the Christian Post?
I'm on a listserv alumni network that I'm a part of. I saw they were looking for reporters, and I was so desperate to make a change career-wise that I thought, I'm just going to apply and see what happens. That's literally it. I didn't know if I was even cut out for it and had no previous journalism experience, but I just dove right in.
Okay. And the topic that you're now writing on and discussing on your podcast, you said, is the gender ideology issue. So how did that come onto your radar? And perhaps even more importantly, how is that something that you decided to delve into the conversation with?
Well, it's kind of an interesting story because my first day on the job during my trial period was the day after the Orlando Pulse nightclub shooting, when all those men were murdered that night. And so I was thrown into covering all things LGBT right away. But I soon realized that everything had shifted away from gay and lesbian issues to transgender and queer and non-binary and all this. And I noticed how language was being manipulated within the news media. Men were being referred to as she and her, and vice versa. Women were being referred to as he and him. And I saw all of this ideology permeating the first draft of history. And I really saw how insidious the language was. And I didn't know much about transgenderism, but it was alarming to me because I was so confused even reading a news article. And I was like, well, who are they talking about? Because it's a male, but it's being referred to as she. And there was another woman being referred to in the body of the article. And so I couldn't even keep it straight. And then I sort of realized what was going on. But it was late 2016 and early 2017 when I learned that this wasn't just about Laverne Cox on the cover of Time magazine or Bruce Jenner on the cover of Vanity Fair. There was an entire apparatus within the medical system, the medicalization of gender, particularly in youth. And when I learned what the blockers were, what puberty blockers were, I often say this, something inside me snapped. And I'll never forget the visceral feeling of horror that I had that first day when I learned what they were. And I walked back to the newsroom and I thought my head was going to spin off my body. Just the lack of medical ethics that you would do that to a child in pursuit of a physiological impossibility just knocked the wind out of me. And so I just knew that I had to dive in, and that the Christian Post, my publication, was going to have to scrutinize this ideology since the legacy press wouldn't. Thankfully, that's not the only thing that I have been assigned to cover, but it has, as I said, been a major focus. I view it as one of the worst medical scandals in history.
I hear that. So you really dove into the issue in 2016 and 2017. So this is something that, I, again, like yourself, I've been very aware of it from around, I want to say around that same time, actually, around
Yeah.
2016 or so, 2015, 2016. But it's one of those issues that's only come onto a lot of people's radar, I think, in the last 1 to 2 years, at least the extent that it's going to. I think that people previously thought, okay,
Mhm.
this is something that affects a handful of adults, but they weren't aware of what was going on with young people and minors, children. They
Mhm.
weren't aware with even what some of the processes are, whether you're talking about the hormones or the surgeries and so on, because it's all coded, as you said, in this fuzzy, fluffy linguistic language that makes
Mhm.
it sound far less insidious than it is. It makes it sound
Right.
like it's just some sort of normal, totally fine thing. So for those who may not be as familiar, can you give an overview of what it is that's actually going on? Because I still don't think I still think a lot of people are kind of sleepwalking on this, or maybe they just think, oh, this doesn't affect me, so why should
Right.
I care?
Right. And I have felt like a crazy man because I've been on this for 5, 6 years now. And you're absolutely right that it's only been within the last year or two, especially within the last year, that
Mm,
the public is finally becoming aware of the extent of the horrors and how systematized this has been within our medical institutions, especially here in the States. You're from the UK, which I think people have been, if they follow this issue at all, they're aware of what's been happening with the Tavistock Clinic and how that has just been ordered to close next year. But yes, in hospitals around this country, around the United States, first one, the first pediatric gender clinic opened in 2007 up in Boston. And Boston's been recently in the news because of their own videos showing where the doctors, the clinicians themselves at that children's hospital have openly admitted to doing this medicalization, including these invasive surgeries on minors.
mhm.
People previously thought, you also said, oh, this is just a few very tightly guarded, shrouded in euphemisms, just a few troubled children. We're helping them. They're going to commit suicide if we don't pump them full of hormones or whatever. People are realizing that this is a social contagion, largely influenced by the internet. It's, of course, children are being inculcated with gender dogma in schools. And so there's sort of a pipeline that exists where schools indoctrinate children into this nonsensical gender ideology, and they then become convinced that they need to undergo some sort of medicalization. That medicalization is all experimental, and it includes hormone blockers to halt natural normal puberty, to then be followed on by synthetic opposite sex hormones, and then perhaps after that, a medically unnecessary body disfiguring surgery to make the body appear as the opposite sex. Sometimes the surgeries are done before hormones. You see young teenage girls getting their breasts amputated. Then there's the genital surgeries, or the bottom surgery, as it's euphemistically called. Those are happening to minors as well, and I can prove it despite the legacy media's protest, saying that they're not. I know the journal citations where doctors have admitted to doing vaginoplasties, for example, on boys as young as 15.
Wow.
And so there's an entire industry that has arisen around this, both within the counseling and therapeutic settings, but also within hospitals, medical institutions, gender clinics. Planned Parenthood is now a leading provider of this experimental medicalization, especially
Mhm.
hormones. They're passing out hormones like candy. You can get testosterone, for example. I know of cases where 30 minutes on a telehealth call and they get testosterone that same day based on a young girl's self-diagnosis that she is transgender. Once you become aware of what's going on, it's just hard to look away because it's quite horrible. There's nothing quite like hearing from parents and they're just howling, crying because their daughters are now sterile. They've managed to come to believe, all within a very short time, that they
Mhm.
are the opposite sex and they need to be medicalized, and the health repercussions are just staggeringly bad. But yes,
Yeah.
it's, as I said, it's one of the worst medical scandals the world has ever seen, in my opinion, because it's pursuing a physiological impossibility. It's all based on a lie that a human person can somehow become the opposite sex, which you can.
Mhm. Why do you think that's become something that's considered a controversial view? I mean, what's very strange about the time we're living in many countries in the modern West, especially in the Anglosphere,
Mhm.
UK, USA, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, is there's this inversion going on. I always call it the inversion agenda, right? There's this inversion going on where completely normal, sane, ethical, reasonable, common sense views and concerns, there there are elements out there and people out there who are trying to paint those as the radical
Right.
views, or as the harmful views, or as the dangerous ones. Stuff that what's so weird when I have these type of conversations is I'm always just like, how is this even a conversation? Like, how's this even a thing? How has society got into a point where you need to explicitly say that someone, that men can't give birth, or that women don't have penises, or that you can't actually, yes, you can change your appearance and you can, do surgeries and use hormones and so on, but you cannot actually biologically convert from male to female. It's or vice versa. It's not possible. I feel like everyone knows this, but people are so either ideologically captured or just so cowardly that they won't just state the obvious.
Well, I think there are a variety of contributing factors to what you've described. I agree that there is such a massive inversion that has gone on culturally about how we understand ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And for this, I have not read the entire book, but I've read portions of it. If you've seen Matt Walsh's movie What is a Woman, he interviews an author, Carl Trueman, I believe is his name, and his book is called The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self.
Yeah.
As I understand from what I have read in that book, he argues, and I'm inclined to agree, that this insanity and the chaos that we now see is rooted from decades ago, when people in the Western world, the Anglosphere, moved away from more moral categories and have adopted, the shift was toward a psychologized self, as I believe he puts it.
Mm-hmm.
And so we've described ourselves in these highly psychologized terms. And sort of with that, you infuse narcissism into that milieu, and you have people identifying as all number of things, even if it's completely divorced from material reality. But the almighty self triumphs.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, even when it is at odds with science or any kind of natural order, that governs the day. And so if that's how you're trained to think, I mean, this revolution in selfhood happened alongside how we, all of these changes within our society, to the point where you can't argue if what's at stake is your identity. Mm-hmm. That's a pretty big fight. That's not a fight that anybody can afford to lose. If your entire identity is wrapped up in all of this, you end up with some pretty inverted times. As a Christian, I think that there's a spiritual evil that is a part of this. Of course, I fundamentally understand the world in that way as a professing Christian. Ephesians 6, kind of the backdrop for this, that there's cosmic battle going on between good and evil. The attack against the human body, I think, can't be ignored. And Jesus said the love of money is the root of all evil. And so when you dare, as any good journalist should, to follow the money that is behind the medicalization of gender, you find that there are people who stand to profit handsomely from doing these things. And that sounds all tinfoil hat conspiratorial, but I've done enough of the research to know that, blockers, they're costing thousands of dollars. You go on this medicalization, you'll be a lifetime medical patient. So it behooves us to ask, well, who benefits from this? It's certainly not the people that are going on these drugs, because you're opening yourself up to heinous medical complications, the least of which is cardiovascular disease, liver problems, kidney issues, infertility. I mean, it's just crazy. I spoke with a detransitioner not so long ago who, I think 18 or 19 years old, she went and got the testosterone injections, caused massive kidney stones, to the point where the endocrinologist who was treating her said that he'd never seen someone that young, a young woman, who had ever had that many kidney stones. And she's now detransitioning, and the doctors that are now helping her detransition don't really know what to do, but they're trying to measure her hormone levels and that kind of thing. So it's a world of hurt.
It is.
There's a lot going on.
Yeah, there's a lot going on. I have read that book you referred to. I've also had Carl Trueman on the podcast not so long ago. So yes, The Age of Psychological Man. I do recommend that book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, for anyone listening who is curious to know how we ended up in this situation in Western countries. It's a dense read. It's not actually an easy read, but it really goes through the history of a lot of these ideas. Yeah, it's such a weird one. This is one topic I've had multiple. I've been speaking about this for years to varying degrees. It's not my sort of main area of focus, but it is just one of those things that is continuously, even though I understand the roots and the history and even the ideology of it far more than most people do, and understand the extent to which it's gone, it still continues to blow my mind, because you use the term conspiracy theory, and it does almost seem like, wait, is this real? Is this really happening? I think if you just were to speak to someone who's not familiar with all of this, and they're like, no, that can't be true. That's not happening.
Oh, yes.
It sounds too far gone.
I've had that exchange many times with people.
Sounds too far gone.
I asked my dad not so long ago, did you ever think you'd live in a country where surgeons will harvest forearm tissue from females to make a simulacrum of a penis? And he said, never in a million years. I mean, the idea that you would carve up the body in this way, again, in pursuit of an impossibility, is just insane. My grid previously for understanding this was, okay, there's a few transvestites, as they were once called, down in New Orleans at Mardi Gras. I never thought those surgeries were medically ethical, but okay, out of sight, out of mind. You could go your whole life without meeting one. They live on the margins of society. Okay, whatever one thinks of medical ethics, it's not really an issue. You start doing this to children? No, ma'am, no, sir. No, I won't have that on my conscience and not say anything about it. I mean, could there be anything more cruel than to confuse and violate the trust of a child about something as basic as their bodies, and then pump them full of drugs that then set them up for a lifetime of horrors? I mean, this is the most sadistic abuse I think I've ever seen.
And it's all wrapped up.
Yeah. And as a Christian, the Lord Jesus Christ doesn't take too kindly when you hurt children. Millstones.
Yeah, I was about to say something about a millstone there.
Yeah.
And the thing is, part of the inversion, though, is that it's all wrapped up in this bow of compassionate language, so that it seems like people like myself or yourself who take an issue with it, particularly when it comes to children, as if, you've got people out there with the, protect trans kids, or, saying all this stuff about, oh, well, if you don't support this, then they're going to commit suicide. Yeah. The whole term gender affirming care, right? It's an inversion. It's not just a lie, but it's the opposite. It's the opposite. Even the term misgendering, right? It's all used in the opposite sense of what the term would actually mean. If somebody is a male and I refer to a male as he, or I refer to a female as she, I'm accurately gendering that person according to the standard rules of the English language and every other language that I'm even aware of. But they're saying that is now misgendering, right? That's now you're misgendering that person because they made this psychological claim that they want to be this other thing. And it's very weird, because language is extraordinarily powerful. And I've really learned I've always known it's powerful, but over the last few years, I've especially learned just how easily people are manipulated by language, right?
Yes.
If you call a double mastectomy a top surgery or gender affirming care, or you call, if someone actually knows what a phalloplasty is, or you've even seen images of what is actually being done with the removal of flesh from the forearm or from the thigh. And you're talking about Frankenstein type experiments. You're talking about really brutal, irreversible, traumatic stuff. But they use this language that makes it sound like, oh, it's just like it's just this very minor thing it's going to make the person happy and it's going to stop them commit. And when you, especially in the Matt Walsh documentary, when you even listen to some of those doctors speaking, I don't know, I'm sure you noticed this as well. They all have this in their eyes and in their smiles and in their, like, it's really creepy.
Yeah.
I was watching it and I was like, man, all of these people seem possessed, right? They seem like they're possessed by
Yeah.
some type of it's weird. I'm just like, this is real on multiple levels. This is strange, and there's a clear pattern.
Yeah.
There's a pattern in the way that they speak and in there. I'm just like, this is creeping me out.
It's funny you say that, because I've had full-on secular atheist people say, if anything could make me believe in demons, literally.
It's dark, yeah.
And I've got no problem like believing that. Obviously, I have my cosmology. I have an understanding of the demonic. But even if you don't believe in any of that, it's just not. This is not scientifically accurate. The human body has a fundamental integrity to it. All of our systems, our endocrine system, they're intricately connected, and to violate the integrity of the body in pursuit of a physiological impossibility, how that doesn't contravene, even if you're not an expert in medical ethics, how that doesn't just strike someone as just deeply wrong on a fundamental level, just shows how, I think, dissociated we are from reality. But to your point about language, that's our very means of communication. That's how we convey reality. And we at the Christian Post never subscribe to this kind of ideology, but it's so insidious, because even when we started reporting on this more deliberately than we were, when this was really exploding in culture, I have to tip my hat to a radical feminist friend who messaged me, and she liked an article that we wrote and we reported, but there were still some of these little euphemisms in there. She said, you ought to think about that, because if you employ the phrase transgender woman to refer to a male, even if you don't believe that person actually is female, you're still conveying, you're using the prefix trans to falsify reality. Because we were not reporting on it in any kind of pro gender identity way, but if gender identity is allowed to eclipse sex, you really do damage to the material reality of sex. And so that's why we refuse to print falsehoods about biology at the Christian Post. We just won't be party to that kind of deception. And the media, I have often said, is most culpable for the medical scandal that is emerging now, because they have used manipulative lingo to cover this up. Because if this is just gender affirming care, what could possibly be wrong with that? The public has been prevented, to borrow a line from Abigail Schreier's Substack, we're living behind an epistemological blockade, because things are shrouded in all of these euphemisms and this manipulative language, because to the reader of a legacy press outlet, nothing seems to be the problem. I had a mom from the West Coast call me. I think one of her kids had been impacted by this, and she had no idea what was going on, because she read the New York Times every day. She thought everything was fine. Then it hits home, and she's like, "Oh, now I've got to go read the Christian Post or the Federalist or the other outlets that will actually say, actually, human beings can't change sex, and to convey with our words that you can is horrendous."
And how big an issue is this in terms of actual numbers and in terms of growth? Because even still, on a day-to-day basis, I see this stuff. I see it online. In the real world, whether I'm in the US or UK or anywhere, I'm not really seeing it. It looks on the surface level. If you just go out day to day and see, it just looks like, okay, everything's fine. Parents are being parents, kids are being kids. I'm not seeing a lot of gender confusion in the day to day or anything like that. But then you go online and you see certain things, or you look at certain numbers, and it's like, whoa, okay, this is a rapidly growing issue. But can you frame some numbers or some data around this so people understand the extent of it?
Well, good data is hard to find, and that to me is itself a medical scandal, because this is all experimental. What we do know, and before I talk about the United States, I'll mention the UK, because the UK has the NHS centralized medical system. You can see the numbers more easily. You probably know that the group Transgender Trend documented, I think, from 2009 to 2019, there was about a decade long, approximately 10 years, where there was a over 4,000% increase in the referrals to the Gender Identity Development Service for girls in that very short span of time. That's enormous. That's an enormous jump from, I mean, what the figure used to be 1 in 100,000 and for boys and 1 in 300,000 for girls. And so now I've seen figures where it's like 1 in 20 young girls are identifying as something other than their biological sex. And so how many are going on hormones and surgeries? That's a different question. In the US, again, because as I was saying a moment ago, you can, on a self-diagnosis basis, go into a Planned Parenthood and get hormones today. And you don't, so in terms of tracking a lot of this, and complicated by the fact that we have 50 different states, 50 different medical systems. I don't know how each public health system tabulates any of these numbers, but because you don't need an official diagnosis, who knows how many people are acquiring hormones? That's scary enough. But what I can tell you is that from 2016 to 2017, the number of girls, young women, and I think that this would include minor girls, according to the American Society for Plastic Surgeons, from 2016 to 2017, the number quadrupled for gender surgeries. Boys, it's also been a jump. Even during COVID lockdowns in 2020, these surgeries were going on full speed ahead. There was a jump from 2019 to 2020, according to the chart that I saw from that same Society for Plastic Surgeons, gender dysphoria surgeries. My feeling, though, on it, Zuby, is that 1 is too many. This is not ethical to do to any child, certainly, but I am not. And some people say, let adults do what they want. Well, I take the view that the best thing to do for someone who's truly suffering from a discordance with their biological sex is to help them to accept their bodies as they are, as male or female. There's many ways to express your masculinity and your femininity. If a boy likes the arts instead of mechanics, great. If a girl wants to be an engineer or is a tomboy or prefers stereotypically manly things, she can still express herself as a female. There's nothing wrong with that. But you don't do medicine in service to stereotypes. And to cut off physically healthy body parts, I think ought to be unconscionable. It is unconscionable to me, and certainly not by any solid ethical standards that I would recognize.
Yeah, I mean, expanding that out to a wider issue, I think a very interesting question, and I don't know the answer to this, but I think a very interesting question is how far, like what are the ethical boundaries of science and technology and medicine, right? I think we would both absolutely agree that just because something can be done, right? Just because a technology or a medical procedure or surgery is possible, that doesn't mean that it's good or it's ethical. And I think a big question we have for, that we're going to be having in our countries, and I guess we're already having, and it's going to go far beyond this issue, I believe, which is just, what are the ethical and moral bounds of what should even be pursued with science? Because some of these questions, some of these issues, 100 years ago, it wasn't even possible, right? We didn't have the technology. We didn't have medical technology for some of the things that are now happening to even be feasible. So it wasn't an ethical question and quandary, because it's not, you can't even envision the possibility. And I think that's going to go on. So while I very much empathize with the position of an adult, generally speaking, being able to do what they want, that's not hurting, directly impacting other people. Even with that, it's like, well, what's the boundary? What's the boundary there? And if you're getting other people involved, right? You've got doctors, you've got people in the medical profession. I'm from a family with a lot of doctors in it. My dad's a doctor, my brother's a doctor. I've got lots of doctors in my family. The role of a doctor is supposed to be, you have ethical boundaries on what you do and what you don't do. If you're a surgeon and someone just comes in and says, I want both my legs amputated, right? And there's nothing wrong with their legs, and they're totally fine with that. All right, I'll give you $1 million to do it. right? I would say that an ethical doctor should say no, right? And an ethical doctor should not be doing things that are medically harmful and that are going to, disable someone, take away a basic bodily function from them completely unnecessarily, right? If you have a cancer in breast tissue and a mastectomy needs to be performed to get rid of the cancer, that's not the same as just removing completely healthy organs. So I don't know. I don't
Right.
even know exactly what the answer is, but I think these are going to become bigger and bigger questions as technology advances.
Well, for those who might be inclined to think, well, let just adults do what they want, I would ask them, what do you say to adult detransitioners who have lived through these surgeries? They were allowed to do it. They made their brains are fully developed past, beyond age 25. That's generally when the lobes of the brain finish forming. And so you're not exploiting a minor. This is an adult making a decision. I interviewed a detransitioner who underwent an orchiectomy in his 30s.
What's that?
An orchiectomy, that's the amputation of his testicles.
Oh, okay.
And he thought that was going to help his problems. And the gender clinicians, according to him, and I examined his medical records, he was legit, corroborated his story with a few others who knew him. And that poor man, the gender clinicians, according to him, never used biologically accurate terms for his body. Because, again, we're talking with the manipulation of language. He was assured that this hormones and these surgeries, they're not going to affect how you look, feel, or function. And he's thinking, well, maybe the surgery is actually going to help me feel better. He's getting off hormones. So they finally, and he described it as a multi-level marketing upsale, he was enticed into this surgery. So he underwent it. And it did not help his problems. About a year later, he winds up with regret because he's got a scrotum that looks like a chicken's neck and a deflated balloon. And then he tries to have sex and he ejaculates blood. Oof. And then it finally occurs to him that, yeah, maybe this wasn't such a good idea. So if we say, well, let adults do what they want, like, are you willing to allow someone to go through that? Mm-hmm. I mean, how do you know that they won't regret this years down the road? How do you know that? Mm-hmm. And are there people who say that they don't regret their surgeries? Yeah, of course. Yeah. Still doesn't make it an ethical thing to do.
Yeah, this is the quandary here, because if we're being honest, of course there are people who do go through. I mean, I don't know what percentage,
right?
And it's probably not even possible to get accurate data on what percentage of people who go through this regret it or who want to detransition, but it certainly appears that there are people who go through it all and are happy with it. I know people. I know a handful, not a huge number, but I know a handful of people who have gone through so-called gender transition, and they maintain that was the best thing for them. In some cases, they did it more than a decade ago, and they're happy with it. They're living their lives. They're not having gigantic medical issues and so on. And so I think, on the flip side, on the flip side of it, there are many people like that who would then say, well, who are you to say that I should not have been allowed to do that? Because in their case, there are absolutely situations where people are just rushed into it. People are just rushed in. They're scammed. They're, not, as you said, they're not even using the language properly. They're not talking about potential long-term consequences and things. But there are also situations where someone's really been through a multi-year process as an adult. They've had lots and lots of time to think about it. Do I quote unquote get it? Do I understand it? No, I don't understand it. And I'm never going to know exactly how that person felt before or now, but it certainly appears like, and those individuals would say, hey, this was the best thing for me.
It's all very subjective though. If once you open the door to saying that it is sometimes okay to physically amputate a body part that will impede the integrity of the organism, the whole functioning human body. Once you open that door to say that is sometimes okay, it's, people say, don't make the slippery slope fallacy. We're cutting off the breasts of 13-year-old girls now. I mean, that's where this leads.
Mm-hmm.
So even if you have this very, very tight process, it's like you still open the door to the principle that has made this made this an acceptable practice. And I think we owe it to our society to ask these, first principle kind of questions. Do we think it is actually moral and ethical to amputate a physically healthy organ just because?
Mm-hmm.
What? Because the suicide line that is fed and it's used as a manipulative threat, especially for parents who are dealing with their minor children, but even in their adult children too, is that if you don't allow your child to do this, they will wind up dead by suicide. And so parents just freeze in a state of panic fear. But the suicide is always a very complicated question. There are so many factors that go into that. And there's no way you can definitively prove that unless you cut a body part off, that suicide will be prevented. There's no way you can verify that claim.
If anything, you can more likely verify the obvious, the opposite.
Right.
Because,
and the famous Sweden is, I think, proof of that, where they actually followed for 30 years the post-operative, what were then known as transsexuals from, I believe, 1973 to 2003, in a very accepting society where they had, I think, a 19 times higher rate hazard of completed suicide against population match controls.
Well, all throughout history, if you'd always secretly had these trans kids hiding everywhere, then they would have been committing suicide all throughout history, because these so-called transitions were not even possible until very recently.
Absolutely. And here's the other thing that I've just never been able to get over this. I'm not yet married or have kids yet, but I hope to one day. And if I'm not, I hope to adopt. If I'm not able to have kids with my future wife, I would love to be able to adopt kids. But the fact that the combination of blockers and cross-sex hormone renders a child sterile.
Huge.
How in the world do you get, sterilizing?
I think that's the goal, by the way.
Well, and
people want my conspiracy theory.
I
depopulation is the goal.
Here in the United States, Black people get it. I would imagine they can, as one, I know a Black left-wing journalist who is totally opposed to this madness, and she has once said, "We can smell the eugenics train rolling into town. We can see it coming," and so that's why they're not down on this. Is mostly, are there racial minorities who are getting mired in this? Yes, some, but this is mostly a very white problem here in the United States. It's these very wealthy, upper middle class white kids who are getting lured into this, but others as well. These clinics will get their paws on any kind of child who they can send down this pathway. But the idea that how that doesn't just ring the alarm bells internally for people, particularly in the United States, where we have a sordid history of experimentation on people where they were rendered sterile. Just because there's a pink and blue flag, waving in the background, doesn't make that a medically sound practice.
Yeah,
to say the least. That's just one effect of it, the sterility thing. There's cardiovascular, many health effects that the combination of these drugs cause in a person.
What are your thoughts on? And this is slightly it's slightly outside the issue, but based on the conversation we were just having there. What about other forms of body modification that people do? Because people do all sorts of nutty. I've seen some real nutty body modifications from people, like putting holes in their cheeks, to massive things in their ears, to splitting their tongues, to putting spikes and all sorts. Like people do some very weird stuff. And again, I ask that same question when it comes to, I think children, boom, hard line, right? Yeah. Children, hard line, no question to me. When it comes to adults and even people who do these like crazy, like psychotic boob jobs, not like a normal boob job, but one where they've got some giant watermelon, right? Again, should a doctor do that? And also, if that's really what somebody wants, is it, should you see what I mean? It's a weird one. I feel like the slippery slope kind of runs in two directions. because I am, as much as I am, I'm a Christian, and I have certainly by Western standards relatively conservative values on most things, and I don't think that just because something can be done that it's good or it should be done. But I'm also cautious of wanting to ban and create laws around everything that I disapprove of, or everything that could be harmful. Because then, there's very reasonable logical arguments to ban cigarettes, ban alcohol, ban this, ban that. And so with those situations, I'm like, okay, I might think that's goofy. I might think it's harmful. I might even think, I think it's foolish to do certain things, but should it be that you're absolutely not allowed to do it? You see what I mean? I don't know. It's a tricky one there.
No, and I think that these are questions that when it comes to lawmaking, these are questions that we have to hash out, and, I'm tracking with you there. I would also agree with your line there about the slippery slope going in a number of directions, because I think it can be argued that these radical body modification practices, whether you're talking about very large piercings or spikes through your your flesh or those other kinds of things, but then you get down to the subtle ones. For me, I think the line that I think is prudent to draw is that, is it going to impede the function of the body? I mean, are you going to radically inhibit your body from functioning as it ought to function? If a non-religious, theological line, but it's that if you recognize the fundamental dignity and integrity to the human body, then I think you're not going to impede the function of your body if you get an unsightly mole removed, or there's a place for plastic surgery that I think can improve the body, and there's obviously some dicey lines there, but with this gender stuff, you're doing so to lie about your sex, and you're impeding the function of the body. If you remove your breasts, you will not be able to breastfeed later in life. So it's not just you're hacking off, fatty tissue, and it's like, no, your milk ducts are gone. You will not. There are functions of your body that will not be there after you undergo this. And again, the difference between a mastectomy it becomes an ethical thing to remove that body part if there's a cancerous mass there, because the intent matters. You're trying to preserve the health of an individual. This idea, though, that for a psychological condition of gender dysphoria, as opposed to a physical disease like cancer, you don't cut the body to heal the mind. You're not going to alleviate a mental distress, certainly not in the long term. There's a certain euphoria that happens in the months after a surgery, as many trans identified people will tell you. They felt like this was the best thing that ever happened to them. Then just give it a little time, and they realize that they made a horrible mistake. And more of these people are putting their heads above the parapet now and saying, please, especially not as a minor, don't do this. Please don't do this. I mean, Chloe Cole, you've probably seen her online. She's going, wow, at 13, she was gender dysphoric, went on blockers early, I think had the mastectomy at 15. And then a year later at 16, she's got regret. And now she's 18 and she's traveling on. Like, these things never should have been allowed. But it does speak to the very larger phenomenon. And I think this is probably the case as Western society has become decreasingly religiously observant, that we've lost a right kind of reverential regard for the body. I think that is, I mentioned Abigail Schreier a moment ago, her Substack line, but she told me when I interviewed her about her book, Irreversible Damage, I said, do you think that the collapse in religious practice is a contributing factor for the breakdown of medical ethics? And she said to me, and I've never forgotten it, she said that when you have a society that practices a robust faith, religious practice, it confers on society a kind of herd immunity from moral stupidity. And I think that's exactly right. That when you lose sight of the higher things. Not to say that there aren't really ethical atheists. I know them. I'm friends with them. I respect them. They're awesome. God bless them, even though they don't believe in God. Applause from me. You don't have to be. You can be a decent person and not believe in God. But I do think that as society has moved away from an understanding that we are, as it says in Psalm 139, fearfully and wonderfully made, that we are made in God's image, that you're not going to desecrate something that you have a reverence for. And I think as we have moved away from that, and I understand why some people abandon their faith, if they're abused in a church, it totally makes sense to me that they don't know how to disentangle God's loving character from a really abusive church. I want to
human actions. Yeah.
I totally understand that and have grace for people. But as our moral categories change, we lose the kind of reverential regard for the body that I think our society should have. And then you wind up desecrating the human body, causing a world of hurt for people. And I hear from atheists all the time that they tell me they can't believe they're reading the Christian Post or listening to a Christian Post podcast because they never thought something like this could happen to their family. And they'll talk to anyone, Republican, Democrat, Christian, atheist, who will tell the truth.
Yes.
Because the truth is true no matter who says it.
Absolutely. Well, I think once a society becomes highly secularized, then they're outside of theft and physical violence,
right?
Physical aggressive violence. There's only a handful of sins. One of them is lack of consent. One of them is judgment. And the other is anything that could be deemed intolerance. And this is something that I've worked out, right? We're living in a time where those three things are considered the greatest sins, perhaps alongside, offending somebody, verbally offending somebody.
Right.
But that's what it is. So it narrows it down to, okay, well, is it consensual? If it's consensual, then it's fine. It doesn't matter what it is, right? The only line is consent. And then if you have a judgment, if you think that something is bad or you are intolerant of something, that is considered a greater sin than what is actually happening, right? The thing you're actually judging, the thing you're actually intolerant of, if it's, it could be a heinous thing like what we're talking about with regards to minors here, but then that's like, oh, well, you're being judgy, you're being judgmental, as if that itself is the great sin. And that's a trend I've noticed over the last decade or so, where it's like, okay, is the only issue something, not being consensual, or why is it deemed worse to judge something if someone does something that you believe is immoral or unethical, and you are vocally judgmental of that, or you say that it's wrong, people will come harder at you for saying that it's wrong than for the person doing the thing that is generally deemed to be wrong. And that's an interesting change in how I'm noticing people are sort of making their moral value judgments.
I agree. And while I certainly want to recognize the importance of, say, the age of consent, like
of course.
Consent is a necessary standard.
Oh, absolutely. But it's not the only one.
on the whole, it's a garbage standard. It can't be the only standard.
It can't be the only one. Yeah.
The example that I often think about in this, and it's a little bit off topic here, but when it comes to the sex trade, this idea that, you can consent to sex but there's money that's exchanged. So even the consent factor totally undermines, are you really consenting here? Or when you're entering into sort of some kind of prostitution arrangement or sex work, as the euphemism, again with the euphemisms. Like, are you really consenting here, or is there another power dynamic at play? Because then you have an entire industry that's trying to legalize this sexual exploitation, but you're talking about, well, if they consent to it, it's fine. It's like, no, you don't get to, pay someone to rape them, because we know that this wouldn't happen but for the money.
Mm-hmm.
Do
you know something very interesting? Maybe you've seen this over the years, and it's actually something I predicted many years ago, and I'm seeing it coming to fruition, which is that a lot of old school, or some may call them radical feminists, on several issues, I've noticed that they end up reaching the same conclusions as more conservative or religious people, just with many more steps. So I'm seeing this emerging strange alliance happening between people who are more traditionally conservative, whether they're religious or not, and not the progressive, super sex positive type feminists.
The
Who
radical feminists would say that's not feminist. Yeah.
Yeah, but the more radical ones who, number one, absolutely recognize that males and females exist as distinct categories and are different. But even when it comes to things like pornography or prostitution or surrogacy, some lots of these issues, even though the epistemology of how they reach there might be different, I found that they actually end up often reaching the same conclusions as people who maybe 10 or 20 years ago they thought were diametrically opposed to them. And I think that's interesting.
Oh, it's fascinating. And I've learned a lot from radical feminists that I've gotten to know in this space. But I knew about that many of them had opposed pornography and prostitution before. But I think look, as a Christian who's conservative leaning, I think I need to, work toward good ends no matter what. And so I'm happy to converse and extend goodwill to anybody. And I think surrogacy, prostitution, pornography are scourges. And so it's incumbent upon anybody who thinks as much to reach out and to be willing to speak and converse with people. It's been an interesting experience hearing, because some radical feminists have religious backgrounds, and hearing stories of being really mistreated in churches. Gosh, it just breaks my heart, because I believe God is love. And, my faith is very important to me, and the Lord Jesus Christ elevated women and treated women with dignity. And I think many conservative leaning Christian men think as much, but then there are some really narcissistic, abusive types in those circles too. And many radical feminists have experiences with those. But look, again, the truth is true no matter who says it. And so however many steps it takes you to wind up, I think the epistemology, the journey of getting there is different, but I'll speak with anyone. I mean,
absolutely.
I think if you want to talk about how pornography is so destructive, how prostitution is monstrously exploitative, how surrogacy is a human rights violation, I'm all ears.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I just think it's interesting how there's this convergence that is that's happening on various issues, which I don't think somebody would have predicted 15 or 20 years ago. I mean, I'm the same. I've done over 200 podcasts at this point. I've had Posey Parker, Kelly J. Keen on. I've had Megan Murphy has been on my podcast twice. I've had Sal Grover from Australia. So I'm the same, man. I'm intellectually curious. I want to talk to everybody. I'm not I have my beliefs and my positions, but I always seek to understand other people. Ultimately, I'm trying to get to the truth. I'm trying to understand the world. I'm trying to understand people in the world. There's 8 billion of us. We're all going to have our differences and disagreements. And I think it's important that at a minimum, we can at least try to understand each other. And then we can, try to find the points of agreement, try to find the through lines, and also just be civil and decent towards each other. I don't like, I think on multiple levels, it does seem like, especially in the USA, people are very fractured and divided. I would say beyond what is reasonable. I think there's a reasonable level of division and polarization. And then there's a level where it becomes, the temperature gets so high that it's concerning, where, it could result in physical violence, or it could result in family and friendship groups, completely breaking apart, and a country not, it's supposed to be the United States of America, not the divided States of America. So whilst people will have their differences, it's important that there still is some overall vision.
Totally agree. And these conversations between groups that are, at odds. I mean, there's plenty that conservative leaning Christians and radical feminists disagree on, to say the least.
Sure.
There's deeper anthropological questions about what is the human body, what does it mean to be human, the teleological aspects of our bodies have a telos. What do they point to? What are they for? Those are very hard questions to ask and to engage in. But look, at the end of the day, what I've noticed, I've seen some conservative Christian men like to blame feminism for a lot of this, where we've got here. And I've heard some interesting arguments about Simone de Beauvoir and existentialist
yes.
philosophy, and that sort of sowed the seeds, and sort of whatever the case may be, however we wound up to this precarious place where it's a very toxic culture, is that I, as a Christian, want to represent Christ well. And even though that's not, sometimes that really triggers people because of their painful experiences with religion, I'm going to have a conversation and try to establish rapport and goodwill earnestly, because I know I don't want to see young women harmed by this. I really don't, especially with this trans stuff. Could there be anything more misogynistic and cruel? Tell a girl that her body is wrong. And the pornography feeds into this trans stuff too, because I despise pornography, but the stuff today, and I don't watch it, but I know it's out there, is this gnarly, choking, violent, horrific kind of pornography, to the point where, I hate to be so graphic, but there's British medical journals I've seen where girls have internal damage to their bowels because of this kind of brutal stuff that their boyfriends are doing to them. But they've seen this in porn.
Wow.
And so girls now are trying, by way of a transgender identity, escape this stuff. I mean, who wouldn't want to escape being an object of perverted male sexual gratification? Just think about what it's like for young girls who grow up in this trashy environment where they have to endure the male gaze, and these young boys are looking at really raunchy smut, and they're then being objectified. I mean, God forgive us. I mean, what our girls are enduring is just terrible. And so I look, you're not going to see me, even if I strongly disagree with feminists on some things, and I do, they have a point.
Agreed. Oh, agreed. Especially now. Now. I mean, at this point, but I think something that gets confused with that term itself, with feminism or feminists, is that there is this bifurcation where you have got, I don't know whether they're called liberal or progressive feminists or fourth wave feminists, or and then you have the radical feminists or the gender critical feminists, whatever, and they're pretty diametrically opposed on things, from even what even is a woman, right? Because one side is, the former are the trans women are women types who are including males into the feminism and claiming it's just a social construct, and it's a very different, even though they'll both call themselves feminists, but actually the meanings are very different. So I think that's why a lot of lay people who don't study this and don't read into it and write articles about it are quick to blame it on feminism, because I think they're talking about that former group, that they themselves are including males in the female definition. So they're like, well, they're the ones doing it, and they're the ones, who are very pro sex work and pro pornography, and they call themselves sex positive and this and that. So it's really two separate groups with the same title, and I think that confuses things.
Again, with the euphemisms, how can you possibly be sex positive and support paid rape? Everything version. How is paid rape sex positive? I mean, what even is? I mean, I'm not. Look, I think sexuality is a wonderful thing. The Song of Solomon is a beautiful. It's celebrated.
It's how we all exist. It's how we got.
Hey, it's wonderful. The idea. I think Christians are sex positive in its truest form. People just don't know what they have. A lot of church people I don't know. I have this big, long theory as to why I think there has been so much shame attached to sexuality within the church. The sexual revolution, I think, has really put churches on the defensive. And in some ways, because I think it's a scourge. I think it's one of the worst things that happened to our society. And it's curious to me to see, talking about that overlap, Louise Perry in the UK, who's got her book out now. And she was saying, I watched an interview she did on, I think it was Trigonometry podcast, and I was just clapping right along, like, you're getting it. This is great. Because it's tremendously destructive to women, but it's destructive as a whole because it crushes marriage and family. And that's the building block of our society. If that is destroyed, there won't be a society to preserve. So but I think there's been a pendulum swing in many churches where churches have responded very moralistically to the sexual revolution. And while I certainly believe in sexual morality as defined by my faith, but there's so much more to sexuality than just its moral dimension. The dimension's important, but there's more to it than that. And so I think the pendulum has now swung back. And so hopefully we'll get to this kind of happy medium, I guess you might say, but where Christians have a more robust understanding of a biblically accurate anthropology, where we can communicate the beauty of what we believe, not in these harsh moralistic terms, but again, without ignoring the moral dimensions too. Try to do both, because I think the world's crying out for that. Amid the ashes of what we have become, while we are desecrating the human body and exploiting people right and left sexually, it's beyond time for a course correction.
I hear that. Maybe some of those old ideas are not all bad ideas. Who would have thought?
Pretty good.
Brandon, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. Where can people find you online?
All of my reporting is at thechristianpost.com, but I would really urge everyone to go check out our new podcast series. It's a 5-part investigative podcast series called Generation Indoctrination: Inside the Transgender Battle. It's on Spotify, Google Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts. We did a comprehensive look at this issue from the medical standpoint, the philosophical standpoint, the legal standpoint, and we explored how this has infected the schools. And then we speak to a detransitioner there at the end and explore a few other interesting angles. Broad variety of contributors. I would urge everyone to check that out. I'm also in Tucker Carlson's documentary called Transgressive: The Cult of Confusion, and that's available now on Fox Nation. And I'm going to continue making some noise in relevant spaces. So christianpost.com is where you can find all of our print stuff.
Fantastic. Brandon Showalter, thanks for coming on Real Talk with Zuby. Appreciate you.
Pleasure. Thank you.